The focus of this video is creating this panel, and this panel has a lot of strips, but we do this all in one piece, and so that what makes it, well, first off, it's interesting, but it's also going to be very easy to put together. So the first thing I did was really decide on the focal. So I've got my gnome, which he was kind of left over from scrapbooking backdrops. And we're going to do a couple leaves because fall is right around the corner. So I know the size of this panel, and all I want to do now is take a strip and scraps of pattern paper. So I've got a backdrop, and this could be solid, but in this case I'm going to go with a pattern. It's got a little bit of a direction on it, but I'm not going to worry about that because once I start fitting these little scrap strips, it's going to get covered up pretty well. And so I've cut these in different sizes. I've got a 3/8, and then I've got a 1/4 inch, I've got a 5/8, and I've got a 1/2 inch. And so these are going to come next to each other. So you situate them so. The only thing you want to make sure is, since we're going to be chopping this up as we go, you want to adhere it all the way the length of your strips. So whether you use glue or you use some sticky tape, they have to go from end to end on this pattern. And so let me get those tucked on there. The other thing, you want them to contrast with your back, but you also want them to complement, in this case, the panel that they're going to end up eventually on. So let me get those stuck on there, and then I'll be back. So after sticking my strips to this back pattern, well, first off, I'm working against a grid, so I'm keeping them level. More or less, it's not all that persnickety because once you chop it up, no one's going to notice. So just get close. And then I just trimmed off this piece. So that back pattern really needs to be a little bit larger than what you're going to end up with. And so I can save this for something else, or maybe even use it on the interior of my card. So once I have this, I'm going to bring in this mat because we're going to cover this. Now, I want to introduce the focal because at this point, the first piece I want to lay down, or the first cut I want to make, I want to kind of situate through this. And so this is going to be down here at the bottom right. And so I want this first big cut to kind of be underneath this. If I were to put this up here, that would work. But if I were to put it up here, I might switch this first cut over here. So let me do that. So what I'm going to do is adhere this from top right probably, and I'm going to cut across this corner. And so I'm going to put this onto this panel, and then I'm going to trim it. And then I'll be back, and we're going to talk about what happens next. Now I'm back, and I've got my first piece, and I've got these scraps. Well, these scraps are going to make up the rest of my panel. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take this edge. This is the flat edge, so it's 90 degrees. So I don't want to come with this kind of catty corner, otherwise you're going to have one hot mess, which might work in a couple designs, but it's not going to work in this one. So I'm going to find a place for this. I'm probably going to stick it here, and again, I'm going to kind of trim it. Now this one's a bigger piece, and I could save everything, so maybe I want to do something like this with this, and then figure out what I've got left over and try and fit it into these last two pieces. Again, I want to keep in mind where this guy's going to go. And so let me put this whole panel together, and then we're going to take a look at the base code and how we finish this off. So here's how that strip pattern paper panel turned out, and as you saw, I had two little niblets left over, and I could have actually tucked this one back in here, and that's about the only place it could have fit. No, actually, I can come back in here and add another piece, but that would close this off. Anyway, so use it until you're done and you like your panel. And now I'm just going to layer it onto a dark chocolate, and then I'm going to layer it onto my card. And so now we're ready to take a look at the focal. So I've got a gnome, and I've got two leaves, I think they go this way. So I've got a pair of leaves like this, and it's cool that I've got holes in here because you really don't want to lose a lot of this. So a small focal works really good on these panels. But it's like a little too open, so the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some vellum, because vellum is a good, when you've got nothing shiny on your card, that is a good way to kind of mellow out some of these pieces. And I'm going to add some green into his hat and his shoes. So I'll be back with the finished card. No surprises at how this finished out. And really, that was a lot of talking for a very basic strip design. And so let's talk about the logistics. So this is a 5x7 card, which means I've got a 6 3/4 by 4 3/4 panel that I'm working against. The finished strip with the layers was 12 inches by 2 1/4, and it just did finish this out. And by basic design, I mean, so I've got that strip that came across first, and then the rest of the pieces kind of come off of that strip, and that's one way to go about this, and that will always work. So if you've never tried it, give it a go. And then on the inside, just have another little cluster. Of course, I'm going to finish the envelope. Leave photos of that, and we're going to talk about the next piece. I wanted to do this piece because I really wanted to introduce using your scraps. And this is really all I've got left of this pattern paper pack. And so I even have 12-inch strips. So it's okay to go ahead and slice them and match them. Just pay attention to pattern. In fact, I had to pull in another piece so I could get a 12-inch long. Now, I did use a decidedly patterned paper. So it's already got blocks, it's already got direction, and so I made sure that my finished strips, in this case I've only got 3 of them, and they fit into about 1 3/4 is how it finished out. So let's take a look at this, because I wanted to make sure I didn't have the one element coming and then the other one's coming off it. And so first I put down this piece, and then I put down this piece, and then I made sure that I had one coming across in the same direction as my initial one, and then used the corners to fill in that spot. Now, I talked about putting your focal over on top of these stripes, but I was left over with a big gap. This is again a 5x7, and since this strip was only 1 3/4, which is about ½ inch narrower, I had very little left over of my 12-inch finished strip pattern. And so I had this big gap, might as well fill it with my focal. And that's how that turned out. Of course, I'm going to use hardware. This is a masculine card, and I like using hardware on masculine cards. And also, this strip is actually 2 layers. So I've got my 1/4-inch stripe over a kind of a patterned gold here. So I introduced gold all the way around. Then the inside, since I had nothing left over, I just included an anchor stamp to finish this card off. And I didn't even have enough for a flap, and so I used another piece of that pattern paper to decorate my envelope. Okay, now I want to work into a larger piece with a wider strip, and I'll take photos of this and I'll be back. For this greeting, I'm working on a 5x7.5, and so these finished strips, which I scallop punch the edges, and I'll talk about that, but these finished strips are about 3½ inches, so they're really wide. Well, first off, this is adorable scribble, so I've only got 11 3/4 to work with, and I've got lots of different patterns in these pastel colors. And honestly, for this design, I prefer more contrasting strips, but as a baby card, it kind of works, and babies and buttons kind of work like men in hardware. And so to put this together, this is more of square layout. So I started with this section, came across this section, came across this section, and filled in my square over here. Now I kind of did both little embellishment techniques. So I followed with little die cut hearts along the polka dot pattern, included one here, and I filled in my gaps with real buttons. Of course, my focal is just some stacked letters. And on the inside, I've just got corner and more buttons. So that's a large piece. Next, I wanted to move into a smaller piece with, again, narrower strips. Okay, this note card is small. So this is a 4½ by 6 inch. And I'm working with about, looks to be 1 I say 1 3/4. So I'm kind of back to the size of the anchor card. And this is, again, almost exactly like my gnome. So I've got the center strip, and then I've got my 2 going to either side. But I added a die cut as one of my strips, so I've got this kind of chain thing. Now the only thing is when you attach them to your back, which in this case is only black, you gotta be really careful to make sure you've got glue all along here, because as you cut it, you don't want the little pieces falling off. So that's something to be aware of. The other thing, the back panel is just, it's not pattern cardstock, it's actually an embossed piece of gold. And so that works really well to kind of fill in these blank areas, because I was kind of knew I was going to have quite a few blank areas left. And the focal is just a topper with some elements from the image in the topper. So I've got some leaves on there. And then lastly, I followed along this primary strip with some gemstones to kind of highlight that. So that is a really pretty piece. It's really easy to put together, and like I said, very interesting. And then I had 1 corner left over, so finished off the inside with that. And in this case, I've got a lined envelope for that piece. So I'll take photos, and we'll be back with a square card. I thought it would be fun to include a Halloween make. And so this is a 6x6 square. And my strip is about where I started at the beginning, so about 2 1/4 inches by 12. And this time, instead of a die cut, I had some ribbon. So it's cool to use ribbons. And actually, if I had some complementary ribbons, your whole strip could just be made up of ribbons. But again, making sure that you're coming all the way across with your adhesive. And so this design, I came across this way first because I knew I would have my focal down in this section. Then I brought in this strip, this strip, this strip. This one doesn't actually meet up here, but you know, with this square card, I was really running out of length. And so I've got a corner here to kind of bring back that initial direction. And my focal's made up of, this time, some colored acetate. So that works really well with these strip designs because you can see through, but it's still changed somewhat. And the back pattern is just a bunch of spooky hellos. And that ribbon is the same ribbon that is here, I've got as part of my focal. Then finishing the inside, I had no strips left over, so just had to kind of use some pattern paper and a sentiment. And so that's how this finished out. Now my last piece is going to be a cheap piece. And so let's take photo. I'll leave you photos with that, and we'll be back for the last make. In this last greeting, I cheated. I used a pattern paper for this element that is a single pattern. So it is it's a pattern paper that already has the stripes on it. And so rather than having to add them and layer them, they are just part of the pattern. And it still looks good. So this is a great way to kind of start playing with this sort of design and how you lay out your strips. And then I've got the same trio of focal, a little bit different than the nose, but it's kind of the same flavor. And then using my empty spots to introduce some colored pearls. And that's the way this turned out. And so kind of along the same lines as good, better, best. Typically, this is the sort of thing you do with the stripe pattern. Either go one way or the other, but you can see where this is a little more thoughtful. Then I did go ahead and use those same patterns and some solids and create a third piece using a technique that I've talked about. So I picked out different color strips. This time I kind of hung with the more the green and the blues. And then in my holes over here, I actually cut into this panel and then included some more squares. And that's how this turned out. So finish out with a photo of these three together so you can kind of see a little progression. And that's all I've got for this video. So I hope you give this technique a try, and I thank you for watching.